Marcus Webb had not cried since he was 9 years old. That was the year his mother stopped coming home before midnight, the year the lights got cut off for the first time, the year he learned that the world did not bend toward boys like him, it pushed back. So he had built something inside himself, something still and immovable, and he had spent the next 23 years adding walls to it, brick by brick, until the stillness became a fortress and the fortress became who he was. He walked into Riverbend Correctional Facility on a gray Tuesday morning in November with his hands cupped in front of him, his jaw set, and his eyes taking in everything, the cracked concrete walls stained brown at the corners, the smell of industrial bleach fighting a losing battle against something older and uglier underneath it, the sound of 100 confined lives pressing against each other. He had been in difficult rooms before. He told himself this was just another one. He was wrong. The corrections officer who processed him was a heavy-set man named Doyle who spoke without looking up, reciting regulations the way a man recites a prayer he stopped believing in years ago. Marcus listened. He signed where they told him to sign. He surrendered his belt, his watch, the small photograph of his daughter Amara that he kept folded in his shirt pocket, 7 years old in the picture, gap-toothed and laughing at something off camera, wearing the yellow dress he had saved 3 weeks of wages to buy her. The officer dropped it into a plastic bag without ceremony and Marcus watched it disappear behind a counter and felt something shift inside his chest, some stone moving to cover something tender, and he breathed through his nose until the feeling passed. He had been convicted of aggravated assault. The man he had hit deserved it, had been threatening Marcus's younger brother Dion with a debt that wasn't legitimate and a crowbar that was very real, but the law did not weigh circumstances the way a decent human being would, and Marcus had no money for the kind of lawyer who could make the law listen. 3 years. He was 32 years old and he was going to be 35 before he breathed free air again, and his daughter was going to be 10, and the thought of that made the stone in his chest press down harder, so he stopped thinking about it and focused on the corridor ahead of him. The general population block was called D-Wing, and within 40 minutes of arriving, Marcus understood its geography the way animals understand territory, through instinct sharpened by necessity. The block was organized around fear, the way most closed systems are. At the center of that fear was a man named Cutter Reyes. Cutter ran the Latin Kings inside Riverbend with a precision that would have impressed a military commander. He was 38, compact and dense with muscle, with a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw and eyes that were the flat, unreadable color of old concrete. He had been inside for 11 years and he had made the prison his country, with its own laws and its own economy and its own terrible justice. Men paid him for protection, for access to contraband, for the right to sleep through the night without worrying. Men who didn't pay paid in other ways. Marcus's first night, a man named Ortega, one of Cutter's lieutenants, came to his bunk and explained the arrangement. It was explained politely, because Cutter's operation preferred willing participants, but the politeness was a thin coat of paint over iron. Marcus listened to the whole thing and then said, quietly and without heat, that he wasn't interested. Ortega blinked. He was not accustomed to that answer. Marcus turned over and faced the wall. He heard Ortega leave. He heard the muffled conversation in the corridor outside, the lowered voices, the particular silence that follows a decision being made. He lay there in the dark and breathed steadily and thought about Amara in her yellow dress, and he did not sleep until almost 3 in the morning. The next 2 weeks were a study in escalating pressure. Small things at first, his food tray knocked to the floor in the cafeteria, his place in the shower line disputed, the particular quality of silence that follows a man into a room when others have been told to make him feel it. Marcus absorbed all of it with the same stillness. He was not passive. He had never been passive in his life, but he had learned something that most men who enter violent situations never learn, which is that reaction is not the same as strength. Response and reaction are different animals entirely. Reaction is reflexive, is emotional, is the thing that gets men hurt or killed or buried deeper in systems they are already struggling to escape. Response is chosen. Response is timed. Response is what you do when you understand the full shape of a situation. He had learned this in a converted garage on Clement Street in San Francisco when he was 14 years old, where a man named Sifu Bernard Lam taught Wing Chun Kung Fu to neighborhood kids for $15 a month or whatever they could spare, and sometimes for nothing at all. Sifu Lam was 60 years old and 5 feet 7 inches tall and had the bearing of a man who had made peace with every shadow in himself, and he had seen something in Marcus, the coiled anger, the hair-trigger pride, and had decided to do something about it. He had taught Marcus not just the forms and the footwork and the devastating efficiency of close-range striking that Wing Chun was built on. He had taught him the philosophy underneath it all. You do not fight to destroy, Sifu Lam used to say, standing in that garage that smelled of sawdust and old leather. You fight to return to peace. Sometimes that means hitting very hard. But you must always know why. Marcus had competed for 12 years. He had traveled to tournaments in 8 countries. He had fought men who were faster, taller, heavier, meaner. He had never lost, not once. And he had retired from competition at 28 not because he couldn't continue winning but because he had started to suspect that winning was not the point, and he needed time to figure out what was. He did not advertise any of this at Riverbend. He carried it the way he carried everything important, quietly, inside, where it was nobody's business. The confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon in the exercise yard. Marcus had been doing forms in the far corner of the yard, the slow, deliberate movements of the first Wing Chun form, Su Nim Dao, which translates roughly as little idea, and which requires absolute stillness at the core while the limbs move. To an observer it looks almost like slow-motion shadow boxing. To Marcus it was the closest thing to prayer he had. He came here most afternoons and moved through the form and let the noise of the yard recede until there was only his breath and his centerline and the sequence of positions his Sifu had embedded in his muscle memory 2 decades ago. He heard them coming, not because they were loud. Cutter Reyes did not announce himself, but because the yard got quieter, and that particular quality of quiet was a sound all its own. There were 4 of them. Cutter in the center, flanked by Ortega and 2 others whose names Marcus didn't know yet. Cutter moved with the patient deliberateness of a man who had done this many times and expected it to go the way it always did. He stopped 6 feet from Marcus. Marcus completed the movement he was in, slowly, without hurry, and then straightened and looked at Cutter with the same expression he had been wearing since he arrived. Not defiance, not fear, just presence. I heard about you, Cutter said. His voice was conversational. Heard you think you're too good for the way things work here. I think I'm good enough to choose my own arrangements, Marcus said. Cutter almost smiled. That's a luxury. You got to earn that in here. I didn't come here to earn anything from you. The almost smile faded. Cutter glanced at his men and then back at Marcus, and Marcus could see the calculation happening, the reading of the situation, the assessment of risk versus demonstration value. In Cutter's world, you could not let a refusal stand. A refusal left unanswered was an invitation to every other man on the block to start calculating their own odds. Last chance, Cutter said, and his voice had changed, had dropped that conversational lightness and become something flat and final. Marcus said nothing. He shifted his weight very slightly, almost imperceptibly, his feet finding the stance his body had lived in for 18 years. Cutter moved fast, faster than a man his age and size had any right to move. He came in hard and direct with a right hand that had dropped dozens of men in this yard and in other places across the previous 11 years. It was a powerful, practiced punch from a man who knew exactly how to throw it. It hit nothing. Marcus was no longer where he had been. The movement was so small it was almost invisible, a slight pivot, a shift of the centerline, and Cutter's fist passed through empty air and his momentum carried him a half-step forward, and in that half-step Marcus was already inside his guard, closer than a punch can function, and he hit Cutter twice in the body with short chopping strikes that landed with a sound like wood on wood, and Cutter made a sound that was not quite a grunt and not quite a gasp and stumbled back 2 steps. The yard went absolutely silent. Ortega came in from the left. Marcus turned into him rather than away from him, the Wing Chun principle of meeting force with redirection, of using the attacker's commitment against him, and Ortega's reaching grab became a lever that put him face first into the concrete wall with his arm bent at an angle that made several watching inmates wince. Marcus held him there for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be clear, not long enough to break anything, and then stepped back. The other 2 didn't move. Marcus looked at Cutter, who had straightened and was pressing one hand against his ribs, and whose face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession and had landed on something that Marcus had not expected. Not rage, not humiliation, something more complicated than either of those. I'm not your enemy, Marcus said. His voice was completely level. I'm not anyone's enemy in here. I just need to do my time and go home to my daughter. Cutter stared at him for a long moment. The yard was still silent, 30 men holding their breath. Then Cutter said, "How old is she?" Marcus blinked. It was the last question he had expected. 7. Cutter looked at the ground. Something moved across his face, something old and private, belonging to a different life or a version of this one that had not become what it became. He had a daughter too. She was 19 now and had not visited him in 4 years, and he had stopped letting himself think about why. "What's her name?" Cutter said. "Amara." Cutter nodded slowly. He looked at Ortega, who was rotating his shoulder carefully, and at his other men, and then back at Marcus. And then he did something that nobody in D-Wing had ever seen him do in 11 years. He walked away, not retreated, not fled, walked away, with the same deliberate patience he had arrived with, as though the calculus of the moment had simply changed and he was responding to the new information. The men around him followed, uncertain, recalibrating. The yard slowly exhaled. A man named Roosevelt, who had been at Riverbend for 6 years and had seen most of what there was to see there, appeared at Marcus's elbow. He was 61 years old and had the careful eyes of a man who had become a student of human nature by necessity. He looked at Marcus for a long moment. "What was that?" Roosevelt said. "That was a conversation," Marcus said. Roosevelt shook his head slowly. "No, I mean the other part. The part before the conversation." Marcus looked at him. "Something my teacher showed me." "Your teacher?" Roosevelt repeated. "Where is he now?" Marcus thought about Sifu Lam, thought about the garage on Clement Street, the sawdust smell, the $15 lessons that had cost his teacher almost nothing to give and had ended up being worth more than Marcus could calculate. "He passed away," Marcus said. 6 years ago." Roosevelt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He left something behind though." Marcus looked at the place where Cutter had stood. He thought about the question Cutter had asked, the question about Amara, the question that had cracked open a moment that could have gone somewhere terrible and let something human into it instead. He thought about Sifu Lam saying you fight to return to peace, and he thought that maybe peace was not a destination but a direction, and that sometimes returning to it required moving through hard things with open hands. "Yeah," Marcus said, "he did." In the weeks that followed, something shifted in D-Wing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that real change always happens, incrementally, quietly, through small decisions that accumulate into something visible only in retrospect. Cutter Reyes did not become Marcus's friend, exactly, but he became something else, a presence that had assessed Marcus and decided to leave him room. And in leaving him room, had left room for other things. Marcus began teaching. It was Roosevelt's idea, initially, the older man asking one evening if Marcus might show him some of what he knew, just the basics, just the footwork. Marcus showed him. Then 2 others asked. Then, astonishingly, 3 of Cutter's men asked. Cutter himself watching from across the common room with that complicated expression Marcus was beginning to recognize as a man in the slow, painful process of reconsidering something fundamental about his life. The classes happened in the exercise yard in the mornings. No equipment, no space, no ceremony, just the forms and the principles and Marcus's voice explaining what Sifu Lam had explained to him in a garage decades ago. "You are not learning to fight," he told them, in almost exactly the words he had first heard at 14. "You are learning to be present in your body, in each moment, completely. The fighting is almost a side effect." Some of them laughed, some of them didn't, all of them kept coming back. 3 months into his sentence, Cutter Reyes sat next to Marcus at a cafeteria table for the first time. They ate in silence for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. Then Cutter said, without looking up from his tray, "I had a teacher once. Before all this, coach named Trevino, wrestling, used to tell me I was going to be something." Marcus waited. "I stopped listening," Cutter said. "Somewhere along the way, stopped believing the thing he was saying about me was actually about me and started thinking it was something he said to everybody." "Maybe it was," Marcus said. "Doesn't mean it wasn't also true." Cutter looked at him then. Something in his face was different, not soft, exactly, because Cutter Reyes was not a soft man and perhaps never would be, but open. The way a window is different from a wall, even when it's closed. "Your daughter's going to know who you are," Cutter said. "When you get out, she's going to know." It was both a statement and something Cutter was saying to himself, from a distance so great that the words barely made it across. Marcus understood that. He nodded. "Yours too," Marcus said. "If you decide you want that." Cutter didn't answer. But he didn't disagree either. Marcus Webb served his 3 years. He taught 112 men the first form of Wing Chun in that exercise yard. He wrote to Amara every week without missing once, long letters full of the things he was learning about patience and about what strength actually was, and about a teacher he had loved who had died before Marcus fully understood what he had been given. He kept Sifu Lam alive in those letters the way good teachers are kept alive, through the passing on of what they showed us, through the chain of understanding that moves from hand to hand across time. On the morning he walked out of Riverbend, Amara was waiting in the parking lot with his brother Dion, and she was 10 years old and still gap-toothed, and she was wearing a yellow dress. She ran to him before he had cleared the door. He held her for a long time in the gray morning air, with her small arms locked around his neck and her face pressed into his shoulder, and for the first time since he was 9 years old, Marcus Webb cried. Not from pain, from the understanding, arriving fully for the first time, flooding in from everywhere at once, that all the walls he had built inside himself had never been the point. That the point was this. That the fortress was not where life happened. Life happened here, in the open, where you could be reached. Sifu Lam had known that, had been trying to show him for 18 years. It had just taken a place with locked doors and concrete walls and a man with a scar and a dead coach's voice in his memory to finally make it clear. You fight to return to peace. He was home.